his more important clients to the sitting room. She also prepares coffee and at least some of their meals. Holmes rudely describes her cuisine as being a little limited. She is probably a member of what would then have been referred to as the lower middle classes. Despite their class differences, Mrs. Hudson's discreet presence becomes necessary to Holmes in particular, and she is clearly devoted to him. symmetrical neoclassical style. Conan Doyle describes 221B as having 4 stories and being 2 window bays wide. As such, it would probably have been classified as a third-rate house, with an annual ground rent of between £150 and £350. Aristocratic families owned almost all the land that central London was built on, and many followed the famous maxim of the fabulously wealthy Grosvenor family: always lease, never sell. This meant that vast family fortunes were founded on the ground rents of innumerable leaseholders like Mrs. Hudson. The landlord of Marylebone was, and still is, the Portman estate. In 1755, Portman, which had been established in the 13th century, leased land to a builder, a certain William Baker, upon which he laid out his eponymous thoroughfare. This system of property ownership continues to announce itself on any street map of London, whereas the highways and byways of many other cities are named for royals, political leaders, artists, scientists, and other notables. London streets testify to the influence of landlords, builders, and architects. The Duke of Westminster, head of the Grosvenor family, for example, owns London's American Embassy building, which is built on his property in Grosvenor Square. Portman Square, Street, Mews, Close and Towers commemorate the freeholders of Marylebone. From the beginning of the Holmes, Watson tenure at 221B, the apartment is the starting point for many of their adventures, and the layout and appearance of their rooms is gradually revealed through Conan Doyle's writing. Almost from the start, the apparent reality of the house, although 221B never actually existed, seemed to fascinate contemporary readers of the Sherlock Holmes stories. In response to this, The Strand published a floor plan of Watson and Holmes' second-floor sitting room. It is a